A group of bishops has announced that on July 25th, they will perform a ceremony that directly defies Pope Leo XIV's authority. And the most shocking part, these are not outsiders. These are not people who were always enemies of Rome. These are men who were once welcomed back into the Catholic Church with open arms, forgiven, restored, and given a second chance. And now they are turning their backs on the Pope and on everything that reconciliation stood for. Pope Leo XIV is facing one of the most serious challenges of his pontificate, and the clock is ticking. If you're new here, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we cover before anyone else does. Imagine being forgiven for something that nearly destroyed your relationship with the most powerful religious institution in the world. Imagine being welcomed back, given a home, given a future, and then years later, choosing to burn it all down. That is exactly what is happening right now. And Pope Leo XIV is the one who has to decide what comes next. The group at the center of this story calls itself the Sons of the Most Holy Redeemer, better known as the Transalpine Redemptorists, a small community of traditionalist Catholic bishops and priests living on a windswept island off the northern coast of Scotland called Papistrache. Remote, isolated, and right now at the very heart of a crisis that is shaking the Vatican. But to feel the full weight of what they are about to do, you need to go back to one moment, one act of defiance that changed the Catholic Church forever. The year is 1988. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a French bishop who had spent decades at war with the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, walks into a ceremony and does the unthinkable. He consecrates 4 bishops without the permission of the Pope. No mandate, no authorization, a direct challenge to papal authority. Pope John Paul II responds immediately. Lefebvre and the bishops are excommunicated. The movement Lefebvre founded, the Society of St. Pius, the sects enters into formal schism with Rome. It is one of the darkest moments in modern church history, and it plants a seed that decades later is still bearing bitter fruit. The Transalpine Redemptorists were born from that same world, deeply influenced by the traditionalist movement, shaped by the same rejection of the post-consul church. They built their community on Papistron, with the Latin Mass at their center and Rome at a distance. For years, they existed on the edge, canonically irregular, theologically radical, and geographically cut off from the rest of the world. For those who don't know Papistranci, it is worth pausing for a moment to understand just how far removed this community is, not just from Rome, but from the world itself. The island is a small, wind-battered piece of land in the Orkney archipelago off the very northern tip of Scotland. There are no roads connecting it to anywhere. The only way in or out is by boat. The community there lives by a strict monastic rule, cut off from the noise and distractions of modern life. Or at least, that is what it was supposed to be, huh? Because what has been happening on that island in recent months is anything but peaceful. But we will get to that. First, let's go back to the moment that changed everything for this community. The moment when, against all expectations, they chose to come back to Rome. Pope Benedict XVI, a man with a profound sensitivity toward traditionalist Catholics, a theologian who understood their love for the ancient Latin Mass better than almost any pope before him, extended an olive branch. He had already taken the remarkable step of liberalizing access to the traditional Latin Mass through his document Summorum Pontificum in 2007. And now he was going further, reaching out to communities that had been living on the margins, offering them a path back into full communion with the Church. The Transalpine Redemptorists accepted it. They reconciled with the Holy See. They returned to full communion with the Catholic Church. In 2012, they were formally established as a clerical religious institute of diocesan right under the Diocese of Aberdeen in Scotland. Bishop Hugh Gilbert, OSB, became their ecclesiastical superior, the church authority responsible for their oversight and pastoral accompaniment. It was a moment of genuine hope, a sign that even communities that had drifted furthest from Rome could find their way back. The story of the Transalpine Redemptorists was held up as an example of what mercy and dialogue could achieve, a living proof that the Church's door was never truly closed. Pope Leo XIV inherited that reconciliation. He inherited the trust that was placed in this community. And now that trust is being shattered, because in May 2026, just weeks ago, the Transalpine Redemptorists published a declaration that crossed every line. They called the popes, who came after the 2 Vatican Council papal pretenders, not misguided, not wrong. Pretenders, illegitimate, including Pope Leo XIV himself. Think about what that means for a moment. This is not a community expressing frustration with church policy. This is not a group of frustrated faithful writing angry letters to their bishop. This is a community that was forgiven by Rome, embraced by Rome, given a canonical home by Rome, now standing up and saying that the man sitting on the throne of Peter has no right to be there. That every pope since the council, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, and Leo XIV, has been, in their words, a pretender. They went further still. In the same declaration, they expressed regret for the 2008 reconciliation itself, calling it a mistake, a compromise of their principles, a moment of weakness they now wished they could take back. They were not just breaking with Leo XIV, they were retroactively breaking with Benedict XVI, the very Pope who had welcomed them home, and they are not stopping at words. Do you think the Church made a mistake for giving this group in 2008? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The man leading this charge is Bishop Pierre Roy, the superior of the Transalpine Redemptorists, and the one who will perform the July 25th consecration if nothing intervenes. His background tells you everything you need to know about where this community has ended up. Roy was ordained a priest by the Society of St. Pius Thric in 2011. He later broke away from even that group, which for all its tensions with Rome had always maintained that it recognized the legitimacy of the Pope, and moved toward a far more radical position known as Sedevacantism. Sedevacantism holds that the papal seat is vacant, that the men who have claimed to occupy it since the Second Vatican Council are not legitimate popes at all. It is the most extreme position in the traditionalist Catholic world, and it places those who hold it completely outside the bounds of the Catholic Church as Rome understands it. To understand just how radical this position is, consider what it means in practice. A sedevist does not simply disagree with the Pope. A sedefist denies that the Pope exists. In their view, the man sitting in Rome, whether it was John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, or now Leo XIV, is not the vicar of Christ. He is an impostor, a usurper, someone occupying the chair of Peter under false pretenses. For a sedevantist, obeying the Pope is not just unnecessary. It is spiritually dangerous because, in their theology, following a false pope means being led away from God, not toward him. This is not a fringe internet opinion. This is a formal theological position held by a growing number of traditionally minded Catholics around the world. People who look at everything that changed after the Second Vatican Council and conclude that the institution which produced those changes cannot be the true Catholic Church. That somewhere between 1962 and today, the visible church lost its way so completely that the only faithful response left is to reject its authority entirely and wait however long it takes for a legitimate pope to emerge. In January 2024, Roy was consecrated a bishop by another set of Aquinist bishop, a consecration that Rome does not recognize, has never recognized, and never will. He holds no canonical standing in the Catholic Church. And yet, he is now the superior of a community that until recently was formally established under the diocese of Aberdeen. And now this man who believes Pope Leo XIV is not a real pope, who refers to Rome as being occupied by what he calls enemies of God, is preparing to consecrate another bishop on July 25th, without a mandate, without authorization, in direct defiance of the man he refuses to recognize as the successor of Peter. The local church has not been silent. Bishop Hugh Gilbert of Aberdeen, the same bishop under whose jurisdiction the Transalpine Redemptorists formerly fall, has already issued an official warning to the faithful of his diocese. What is coming on July 25th, he has made clear, is a grave act of disobedience. Those who participate in it, those who facilitate it, those who formally adhere to this community in its current state, all of them are placing themselves outside the communion of the Catholic Church. But warnings, it seems, are no longer enough for a group that has decided the Church itself is no longer legitimate. July 25th is days away. Do you think Pope Leo XIV will act before it happens? Let me know below. And to understand why his decision carries so much weight, why this moment is different from anything he has faced before, you need to know what happened just weeks before this announcement. Because Pope Leo XIV has already been tested, and the way he responded tells you everything. There is something that makes this moment uniquely painful for Pope Leo XIV, something that goes beyond canon law, beyond theology, beyond the procedural mechanics of excommunication and schism. He has been here before. Just weeks ago, on July the 1st, 2026, the Society of St. Pius gathered in Aon, Switzerland, and did what Archbishop Levra had done in 1988. They consecrated 4 bishops without a mandate from the Pope. It was deliberate, it was premeditated, and Pope Leo XIV saw it coming. He had personally written to the superior of the SPX on June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, one of the most sacred dates in the Catholic calendar, pleading with them not to go through with it. A personal letter from the Pope, not a canonical warning, not a legal ultimatum, a personal appeal written by a man who leads a church built on the belief that no door is ever fully closed. They ignored him. Within 24 hours, the Vatican responded. The excommunication decree was signed by Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. The same dicastery that was once known as the Holy Office, the institution historically responsible for defending the unity and integrity of Catholic doctrine. And the decree was sweeping, unprecedented in its scope. Not just the bishops involved in the consecrations, not just the men who performed the ceremony and the men who received it. Every priest of the SSPX was placed in a state of formal schism, and a warning was issued to lay faithful. Those who formally adhere to the movement are in the same canonical situation. Confessions heard by SSPX priests invalid, marriages celebrated by them invalid. The sacramental life of anyone who followed this group into schism was in the eyes of the Church no longer valid. It was one of the most decisive canonical actions in decades. Harsher in many ways than the response to Levra himself in 1988, and it sent a message to the entire Catholic world clearly and without ambiguity. Pope Leo of XIV does not hesitate. He does not negotiate with defiance. He acts. But now comes the harder question. Because the Transalpine Redemptorists are not the SSPX, the SSPX had always been irregular. Their tension with Rome was built into their DNA, inherited from Levra, sustained through decades of theological dispute, maintained through a long series of failed negotiations and broken dialogues. Their disobedience, while grave, followed a pattern that Rome had been watching and managing for nearly 40 years. The Transalpine Redemptorists were different. They were forgiven. That distinction, according to Gaudium Press, which has been following this story since its earliest stages, is not lost on those inside the Vatican. There is a profound difference between a group that was always difficult and a group that was trusted, welcomed back, given a second chance, integrated into the canonical structure of the Church, and then chose betrayal. And that difference is what makes the question Pope Leo for now faces so much more agonizing than anything the SPX crisis presented. Was the reconciliation of 2008 a mistake? Did the Church place its trust in a community that was never truly committed to unity, that accepted the olive branch, not as a genuine return, but as a temporary shelter while waiting to find their footing again? Or did something go wrong in the years that followed? A failure of dialogue, a failure of accompaniment, a failure of pastoral attention that pushed this group toward the radical edge they now occupy. These are not comfortable questions. They have no easy answers, and no one in Rome is answering them publicly, but everyone is asking them privately. What we know from the public record is that the deterioration did not happen overnight. For years, after the 2012 formal establishment of their institute under the Diocese of Aberdeen, the community maintained at least a functional relationship with church authorities. The tensions were always present. Their theological convictions had not changed dramatically from their pre-reconciliation years, but the formal structure held. Bishop Gilbert maintained oversight. The community operated within, if only barely, the bounds of their canonical situation. But the restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass imposed in more recent years deepened their frustration into something darker. What had once been a grievance became a conviction. The conviction that Rome was not merely making a mistake, but revealing its true nature. That the church they had returned to was not the church they believed in. That the reconciliation they had accepted was not a return home, but a compromise of everything they held sacred. Their theological positions grew more extreme. Their public statements grew more radical, and at some point, a point that is difficult to identify precisely, but whose effects are now impossible to ignore. The gap between where they were and where Rome was became a chasm. Too wide, too deep, too filled with years of accumulated bitterness, theological grievance, and spiritual estrangement to cross. By May 2026, the break was no longer coming. It had arrived, and with their declaration calling the post-consul popes pretenders, they had made sure that everyone knew it. And then, just as the Vatican was still processing the shockwave of the SSPX crisis, the Transalpine Redemptorists made their announcement. July 25th, another consecration, another direct challenge to the Pope's authority. Another act that under canon law carries automatic excommunication and constitutes the crime of schism. But there is something else happening on Papistri right now, something that the headlines have largely overlooked, but that adds a deeply human layer of darkness to this already troubled story. In April 2026, a young member of the community went missing under circumstances that shook the island deeply. The Pillar Catholic, one of the most respected independent Catholic news outlets, reported that the tragedy cast a long shadow over a community that was already fracturing from within, and the community pressed on. Around the same time, 3 members of the community made a decision of their own. They left, not through the front door, not with permission, not with any announcement. In the middle of the night, they arranged a boat departure from the island without informing the rest of the community. They had reportedly used a monastery laptop to contact Bishop Gilbert directly and make their plans. Those 3 members have since cut off all communication with the Transalpine Redemptorists entirely. These are not the signs of a community preparing for a sacred ceremony. These are the signs of a community that is coming apart at the seams, one that is fracturing from within even as it prepares to fracture from the Church. And yet Bishop Pierre Roy presses forward publicly, defiantly, with a date on the calendar and a man ready to be consecrated. For Pope Leo XIV, the challenge now is not simply how to respond canonically. It is how to respond as a pastor, as a man who leads a church that believes in mercy, in dialogue, in the possibility of return, while also being unequivocally clear that there are lines which, when crossed, carry consequences that cannot be waived. How does a pope extend his hand to men who have declared him an enemy of God? How does he hold open a door that they are actively trying to destroy? He showed with the SSPX that he can act with speed and force when the moment demands it. But the Transalpine Redemptorists are a different kind of wound. They are not just a group that disobeyed. They are a group that was loved back into the church and chose to leave anyway. That is the kind of betrayal that does not just demand a canonical response. It demands something deeper, something more personal. And the Catholic world is watching to see if Pope Leo XIV has what it takes to face it. Here is what the mainstream Catholic media is not telling you. While the official narrative focuses on canon law, on excommunications, on mandates, on the technicalities of who has the right to consecrate whom, there's a much bigger picture forming. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Look at the timeline. The Society of St. Pius Dacet consecrates 4 bishops on July the 1st. The Vatican responds within 24 hours with the most sweeping excommunication decree in decades. And within days, a second group announces another unauthorized consecration scheduled for July 25th. 2 groups, 2 acts of defiance within the same month against the same pope. Is this a coincidence, or is something more coordinated happening beneath the surface? Euronews, which has been tracking the traditionalist movement across Europe for years, raised a question that few Catholic outlets have been willing to ask directly. Are these acts of defiance connected? Are the Leverists and the Transalpine Redemptorists moving in parallel, not by accident, but by design? Is there a broader, more deliberate push within the global traditionalist world to stress test Pope Leo XIV, to send challenge after challenge, to see how far Rome will go, to discover whether the Pope, who acted so decisively on July the 2nd, will blink when the pressure is applied again? No one has proven a direct organizational connection between the SSPX and the Transalpine Redemptorists. These are distinct communities with different histories, different theologies, and different relationships with Rome. But the pattern, the timing, the escalation, the public defiance is hard to ignore. And inside the Vatican, sources familiar with the situation have acknowledged that the rapid succession of these challenges is being taken very seriously, not just as isolated canonical problems, but as a signal of something larger stirring within the traditionalist movement globally, a movement that senses rightly or wrongly that this is a moment of vulnerability for Rome. That a pope only 1 year into his pontificate, still establishing his authority, still finding his footing, might respond differently than a pope with decades of institutional weight behind him. They may be miscalculating, but the calculation is being made. Because here's the truth that no one in the Catholic media wants to say out loud. The traditionalist world is not a monolith. It is a spectrum ranging from communities that simply love the ancient Latin Mass and are in full faithful communion with Rome, all the way to groups that have essentially built a parallel church. A church that operates by its own rules, recognizes its own bishops, administers its own sacraments, and answers to no pope because it does not believe there is a legitimate pope to answer to. And that spectrum has been quietly radicalizing for years. The restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass accelerated that process dramatically. The perception, right or wrong, fair or unfair, that Rome, under recent pontificates, has been hostile to the ancient liturgy, has been dismissive of the faithful who love it, has been more interested in dialogue with the world than in protecting the traditions that have defined Catholicism for centuries. That perception has pushed more and more people toward the edges. And the edges, as we are now seeing with devastating clarity, are willing to do things that the center never imagined possible. Pope Leo XIII did not create this crisis. He inherited it from decades of unresolved tension, failed negotiations, and a fracture in the Catholic world that has been widening since the 1960s. But he is the one who must now contain it. And the question that Catholic observers around the world are now openly asking is whether containment is even possible, or whether what we are watching is the beginning of something the Church has not seen since the Protestant Reformation. A fracture that starts with a few small communities on the margins and grows slowly and then suddenly into something that reshapes the entire landscape of Christianity. That may sound dramatic, but consider this. Every major schism in church history began with a small group of men who were absolutely convinced that they were more faithful to God than the Pope. Every single one. And every single time the church said it was under control until it wasn't. Now, here is what I want you to hold on to, because this story is not just about bishops and canon law and a remote island off the coast of Scotland. It is about something much more personal, something that touches every single person who has ever walked into a Catholic church, knelt in a pew, lit a candle for someone they lost, and tried to hold on to their faith in a world that makes it harder every single day. The faithful ordinary Catholics, people like you, are caught in the middle of this. They did not ask for this crisis. They did not sign up to be pawns in a theological war that has been brewing since the 1960s. They are not interested in the internal politics of the Vatican, the canonical distinctions between schism and irregularity, the fine print of excommunication decrees. They are simply trying to live their faith, to raise their families in the church, to find meaning and community and grace in a world that offers very little of any of those things. And now they are being told that the priests they trusted, the sacraments they received, the confessions they made, the marriages they celebrated in front of God, and their families may not be valid in the eyes of the church. That the community they belong to has placed itself outside the bounds of Catholic communion. That the spiritual home they thought they had found was built on a foundation that Rome no longer recognizes. That is not an abstract canonical problem. That is a wound, a deep, real human wound. And Pope Leo XIV knows it because at the heart of every public statement he has made since this crisis began, in every decree, in every pastoral letter, in every reference to the faithful as the holy people of God, there is a consistent and unmistakable thread, a pastoral instinct that goes beyond the language of law and punishment and institutional authority. He is not just defending the papacy. He is defending the people. He is defending the ordinary Catholics who deserve to know that the sacraments they receive are real, that the church they belong to is one, and that no group of rogue bishops, however sincere in their convictions, however passionate in their traditionalism, has the power to take that from them. That is why July 25th matters. Not just as a date on a canonical calendar, not just as another test of papal authority, but as a moment when Pope Leo XIV will once again have to stand between the faithful and those who would fracture their church and decide in real time how a pope responds when mercy has already been extended and rejected. Will he act before the consecration happens? Will he reach out one final time as he did with the SSPX on June 29th with a personal appeal, a last offer of dialogue before the doors close? Or has that moment already passed? Has the declaration calling him a pretender, an enemy of God, an illegitimate occupant of the throne of Peter? Has that declaration closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation, at least for now? These are the questions that the Vatican has not yet answered publicly. And they are the questions that will define not just this moment, but the shape of Leo XIV's entire pontificate. Because how a pope responds to betrayal, how he holds together mercy and authority, forgiveness and consequence, the open hand and the firm line, that is what tells you who he really is. Not the ceremonial moments, not the crowds in St. Peter's Square, not the speeches and the encyclicals, but the moments when the institution is under pressure and the person inside it has to choose. And here's something else worth sitting with. Pope Leo XIV is an American. Robert Prevost, the man behind the white cassock, the man who carries the weight of one of the oldest institutions in human history, grew up in the United States, was shaped by its culture, its directness, its instinct for pragmatism and action. He is not a man who was born into the corridors of the Vatican. He came from the outside, and that matters, because it means he sees the church and the people who make up the church with a clarity that is sometimes difficult to find from the inside. When Leo XIV looks at a faithful Catholic family that has been attending a traditionalist mass for years, not out of ideology, not out of any desire to challenge Rome, but simply because that was where they found God, and then has to tell them that the priests they trusted placed themselves outside the church. He is not reading from a canonical manual. He is carrying a pastoral weight that no decree can fully capture. That tension between the institution and the person, between the law and the mercy, between the line that must be held and the soul that must be reached, is at the heart of everything Pope Leo XIV is navigating right now. What we know from 2,000 years of church history is this: the church has survived schisms before. It has survived moments that looked from the inside like the end of everything. Moments when the center could not hold, when the fractures seemed too deep and too wide to ever be healed. And it has always, not quickly, not without immense pain, not without losses that left permanent marks, but it has always found its way back to unity. The question now is whether Pope Leo XIV is the man for this particular moment. Whether the forgiveness that Rome extended in 2008, the forgiveness that has now been thrown back in its face, will make him more cautious the next time mercy is offered, or more determined whether the wound of this betrayal will harden him or deepen him. And that is a question that goes beyond this story. It goes beyond the Transalpine Redemptorists, beyond the SSPX, beyond the canonical machinery of excommunications and decrees. It goes to the heart of what kind of Pope Leo XIV wants to be, and what kind of church he wants to lead into the future. A church that is firm enough to protect its unity, humble enough to acknowledge its failures, and brave enough to keep the door open even when it has been slammed in its face. That answer is coming. July 25th is almost here. And when it arrives, when the world finds out what happened on that island and what Rome's response will be, we will be right here with the full story, with the context that the headlines miss, with the sources, the analysis, and the truth behind what is really happening inside the Catholic Church right now. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening inside the Catholic Church right now, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear this before July 25th. And if you want to be here when the next chapter breaks, you know what to do. God bless you. Stay close to the truth, and we'll see you in the next